I'm afraid I'm going to have marker problems. Oh, that'll work. We'll do red. Away and get new ones. But I always think about that at the end, and then I put it away, and then I don't think about getting it while it's put away. I don't think about it. I bring it out to get it, then it's too late. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Are we early yet, or are we good? Okay. Have to make sure we time it with the Facebook. This is a class on the history and polity of the UCC. And I can't do anything halfway. I can't just focus. So you're going to get more than probably you wanted to know, okay? But hopefully I'm going to make it somewhat interesting. I hope not to drive Diane away. She says she's going to come and try it once. And if she gets bored, then she's going to leave. So hopefully she'll come back after this session. I've got to give you a bad time, Diane. So this first session, we're actually not going to get into the churches that started the UCC yet, because there's some strange strains of thought that started kind of before the Reformation that kind of continued into it, that kind of set the stage as it was. So I'm going to give kind of a quick snapshot of what came before the Reformation, not clear back, but kind of the state of the church at the time of the Reformation. So in 1054, there was a schism which set up two basic churches in two divisions in the Christian church. Eastern Orthodoxy and the Roman Catholic Church. Essentially the Eastern and Western churches. And I'm not going to go into detail of the schism, but mainly the theological basis of it was a difference on how the Trinity was made up. The main impetus for the schism, however, was not theological, it was political. The power was residing in the western area. It ended up residing in the western part of the empire, and the eastern part felt like they were being ignored, and so they just went off on their own. As a student of history, you might disagree with that, Dayton?
I don't know details on that at all, but I'm very curious what was the theological problem.
Well, how they, there was a difference on how they saw the Trinity, of the hierarchy of the Trinity. The Eastern Church saw that in the Trinity, in the Godhead, you had the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and that the Father and the Spirit were one, and out of the union of the Father, the Creator, and the Spirit came the Son. The Western Church believed that the Father and the Son were one, and out of the union of the Father and the Son came the Spirit. So that was the main theological difference. And we can see it most sharply in one of the creeds, in the Nicene Creed, because of this controversy, Constantine, the Emperor Constantine, decided he was going to just solve this because there was going to be a church council that would just resolve the difference, and he would rule and make it end, the whole controversy end. So out of the Nicene Council of Nicaea came the Nicene Creed, and in it you see the Son begotten, not made, all that language in there that was to kind of put the Eastern churches in their place. But like most edicts, it didn't work. They went away, they were unhappy, they were chastened, but they still believed it, and eventually it was one of the contributing factors that caused them to break with the Western Church and go off on their own. In the Eastern Church, Eastern Orthodox churches still exist. There's the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church. So, and if you walk in, there's a whole different style of worship. We're not going to go into that. I have to make sure I don't spend too much time on digressions. Okay.
If I could just add quickly, you notice the difference in the shape of the church, where we're familiar with our shape. Greek Orthodox are usually, they're a cross, but they come out rounder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because the Western Church followed more closely the model of the basilica, which was actually based on it was a Roman invention. There's a whole theology behind architecture too. We could come up with all these different classes if you want. Okay, so this was the state of the church. During the Middle Ages, there was two Christian churches: Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholic. During the Middle Ages, there developed to be a decay or a failing of the church. It started to go into disrepair. And there's a number of causes for this. There's a number of reasons why this happened. One was the remnants of the feudal system. The feudal system, most of you know, there's just these little fiefs around, and each had their own lord and their peons. And so with the remnant of that system, there was no middle class, there was no merchant class, you were either a lord or you're a peon. And so there's a great disparity of wealth and power. There's those who had it and those who didn't, and that was it. So that kind of disparity hurt the church, in some ways helped the church financially, because they had all these lords giving it money, and it grew in power and influence. But on the other hand, it weakened the church in that church leadership became separated and distant from most of the people that it was to lead. Most of the faithful were not lords. They were not landed. They were not rich. But most of the church leadership were. So you had a bunch of leaders who felt like they knew what was best for everybody, and most of the people saying they followed the church because they felt like they had no choice, but they didn't feel like they were understood. So that was one of the reasons. Another reason was something we might understand in the last couple of years. I spelled it wrong, but the bubonic plague. devastated Europe. Just absolutely devastated Europe. There was also political differences. Mainly between England and France. And there was, and Italy, and they were debating on where the leadership resided. And at one time, the Pope for a while, the Pope resided in Avignon, France. But in Rome, Italy, there was another Pope, and to resolve it, they named another Pope. So at one point, there was 3 people claiming to be Pope. So you had all this stuff going on. And still you had the church saying, we're all powerful and you have to abide by us. And we're the only way, the church, our leadership, is the only way you can be saved. You cannot be saved by any other way but through the auspices of the church. Otherwise, you are damned. You have no hope. So it's kind of to that context that the Reformation comes into. And there's another aspect, a very important aspect that led to the Reformation, and that was the Renaissance. You might know what the Renaissance was. You're a teacher.
Well, the Renaissance was a look forward and trying to see, from an art and music perspective, the beauty in things and not looking forward and not looking back at the feudal times and so on and so forth. It was a huge cultural explosion.
Yeah, it's a rebirth in a way. And what prompted it was one of the biggest things that affected the Middle Ages, and that was the conquest. The Eastern Church during the Middle Ages was under attack. It was under attack by Islam. The Arabs, especially the Arab Islams, were conquering new lands. And so mostly Europe sent forces in crusades to battle the invasion and to save the church. They ultimately failed. They had some successes, but they ultimately failed. Islam spread anyway. But one of the results out of that was the Renaissance. Because you had all these soldiers coming back from foreign lands with a greater appreciation of other cultures and of cultures that were older than their cultures were. And they brought with them a new appreciation for art, for music, for all those things that had been forgotten during the, quote, Dark Ages. Science, math had a sudden explosion. The number system we use is an Arabic number system. It's called the Arabic numbers. That came into development in there. So the culture of Europe came through a sudden explosion of thought and thinking as a result of the Crusades, because they were influenced by other cultures and became more world conscious. So all this made things ripe for change. the people were no longer going to be happy. The feudal system was changing to a more mercantile system. There's guilds starting to develop. People were going into business for themselves, developing trades. So the lords no longer had power. People were starting to get power for themselves. And then something amazing happened that changed the world. Any guess? Printing press. Suddenly knowledge wasn't no longer the sole possession of the rich. Everybody had at least the possibility of learning, of reading. Suddenly the Bible was available for everybody. It was no longer the possession of only the church leadership. Wow, what a concept. The Catholic Church, the church leadership, resisted this change. They wanted to maintain their power. They wanted to be the sole interpreter of the scriptures. They didn't want the average person in the church to be able to read the Bible. They wanted to be the only ones to read the Bible, therefore they could control what was believed and what was not believed. But they couldn't stop progress. So, now we get into the streams of thought that resisted and kind of brought on the change. Basically, there was, I have to look at my notes here. There was 3 movements that knew that something needed to change, but they wanted the change to be more gradual, to be more less tumultuous. And the first one was scholasticism. Scholasticism was important, and it led to the Reformation, because what scholasticism thought was that, and this came out during the age of, it brought about the age of Enlightenment, but it basically believed this, that through human reason, we can comprehend the mysteries of faith. That human reason can get us there. That we can explain God. That we can explain all the mysteries of the universe. That we have the power of our intellect through reason and logic to be able to solve the mysteries of the universe. And this became very important in church leadership because they thought, if we can show through reason and logic, prove the existence of God, prove the mysteries of faith, then we can keep our influence over the church. And there was a number of thinkers along those lines. The biggest ones were Anselm, Abelard, Aquinas, I think. I know, the 3 A's, right? Anselm actually came up with a proof for the existence of God. Simply put, it says, there has to be something that nothing is greater than, because greater is a comparative thought. So in order to understand something being greater than something else, there has to be something that nothing can be greater than. Make sense, logically? that which nothing is greater than must be God. Makes sense, right? So that was his proof for the existence of God. God must exist because there has to be something that nothing is greater than. Fairly simple, fairly simplistic. There have been people, numerous people, putting that basic question since that have problems with that simplistic notation, but for the average person, for the church, it made sense and it carried a lot of weight for a long time. Abelard actually coined the term theology. Our word theology came from Abelard. Abelard said that we have the ability to study God. That God has placed within us ability to comprehend, to understand, and therefore God has given us the ability to understand God through thought and reason. Abelard's story is a tragic one. Anybody ever heard the story of Abelard and Eloise? Abelard fell in love with this woman by the name of Eloise, who had an abusive father. So in order to save her, he helped her gain access and to be able to live in a convent. Eloise's father's brothers, or Eloise's uncles, in revenge, captured him and castrated him. And so he went into the monastery, and there are letters between Abelard and Eloise, love letters, written their whole lives. They kept their relationship. Even though he was in a monastery, she was in a convent, and they would never be together physically. They had this love that transcended place and time. And people who have read, I haven't read the letters, but people who have read the letters say that they're almost life transforming in their beauty. So the letters back and forth. And then there's St. Thomas Aquinas. St. Thomas Aquinas, his father wanted him to become a lawyer. He decided to become a priest, and his father disowned him. And he spent his life studying, and he became one of the premier thinkers of the Catholic Church. And he also followed along with in the school of Anselm and developed the idea that you can determine, you can prove the existence of God, and you can prove all the thoughts of the church. So scholasticism thought, okay, we can deal with all the turmoil through thought and reason and just concretely solve it just by thinking about it. Another movement was the conciliar movement. There was a thought that since the church was divided, you had divisions between the church in France, the church in Italy, the church in Great Britain and Spain. You had all these controversies going on, that there needed to be another church council like the Council of Nicaea. They've forgotten that it wasn't as successful as it pretended to be. And they thought, if we could just have a church council, then we could solve these problems. And they did. They had a council in Pisa. You know, the Tower of Pisa? They had a council there. Didn't do much. And the last one was the mendicant movement or the monastery movement. There were always, throughout the church history, there were always monks. And, but during this period of time, there developed two monastery movements that became very influential. One was the Dominican, and the other was the Franciscan. And how they sought to solve this problem is they thought, okay, we can't solve these problems, but what we can do is focus people on the practice of faith. Through service, through study, the Dominicans through study, the Franciscans through service, we can focus the people on what it's like to live a Christian life, what Christian life means. And so all these movements were instrumental in helping to set the stage for the Reformation. But they mostly sought to work within, they didn't seek to reform the church as such. They thought to solve everything within the order. There was no questioning of the order yet, of the power of the church or how the church operated, of the leadership. There was no direct questioning of the leadership of the church. That's where the last movement comes in that has the most direct effect on the Reformation. And that is humanism. It's kind of related to scholasticism in that it believed in the power of the human mind or the human being. It had a focus on human beings, but in a different way. What it said was concentrated within the church and challenged the authority of the leadership of the church. And there's two major people that challenged the church most severely. One was John Wycliffe. There's no dot there. You know who John Wycliffe was? First person to translate the Bible, right? He translated the Bible into what was called the Vulgate. Or he translated the Bible from the original Greek and everything to Latin, which everybody was supposed to be educated in. So it became more accessible. The church had a problem with that, but what they really had a problem with was that Wycliffe, he argued that it was the church, the power of the church resided in the people and not the papacy or hierarchy. The power of the church was a power on earth, but the power resided in those who were, in the terms then, predestined to be saved. And one of his students, or one of the people followed him, and he was in the late 14th century, the late 1300s. in the early 1400s or the 15th century was a guy, and Wycliffe was in England. He mostly operated around Oxford. There was another guy by the name of John Huss, and he was in Bohemia. And he was influenced by Wycliffe, but he took it one step further. He said, a pope that does not follow the Bible should not be obeyed. Wycliffe was disowned by the church, but he lived to be old age. John Huss was burned at the stake for heresy because he had the audacity to say maybe the Pope might be wrong. These two church leaders did as much as anything to set the stage for the Reformation, which was a challenge to the authority of the church.
Where does Martin Luther?
Okay, he's coming in later, okay? This is the 14th, 15th, or late 14th, early 15th century. One more thinker before we get to Luther and the rest. His name was Erasmus. And this is where humanism really found its full voice. Erasmus was considered to be the father of religious humanism. And he changed the emphasis from theological matters, to ethics. To be clear, he didn't have necessarily a problem with the scholastics like Aquinas and those who argued all the theological principles. He just said that's not what's important. It has its important, but what's really important is not so much how we think about God or how we think about our faith, the questions of how many angels can fit on the head of a pen, or whether Adam and Eve had belly buttons, which were fun theological arguments. He says, those are fine. But what really matters is how one practices one's faith. It resides in the ethical, not the theological. He says, I want to know how you live out your life like Christ. I'm not as concerned about how you believe how Christ fits in the Godhead as much as how you live out the principles of Christ, the moral teachings of Christ. Erasmus was caught in the middle of the glory days of medieval Christianity, where church had the power, and the Reformation. Because he had reforming ideas that the power shouldn't reside strictly in the papacy and in the hierarchy. But he believed that change should happen within the life of the church, and that that the church still should remain its power. So when Martin Luther came in towards the tail end of Erasmus' life, there was actually a debate between them. And the debate centered around free will. Luther essentially said, we don't have free will. We are saved by grace alone. We do not have the power to gain our own salvation. It is strictly a gift from God, so we do not have control over our salvation. Only God does. And the other reformers, which we'll get into too, had a similar belief, predestination, the whole thing, that the power of salvation resides solely in God. We don't have control of that. And so it kind of argued against free will. Erasmus said, if we don't have free will, then even the evil that we do is preordained by God, and therefore God is causing us to do evil, and God must therefore be a tyrant that causes us to do harm in the earth. Right? And that became the whole debate of the Reformation. Concept of omnipotent God, all-powerful, all-knowing, everything God, who controls the whole universe, outside of which nothing is outside of God's control. And human agency. Where do we fit in such a world? Where's our responsibility? What's the truth of free will? Do we have really any free will? Or is it just a mirage? That became the question of the Reformation. And it came out in all the individual thoughts. The idea of predestination, the role of the sacraments, the authority of the church, the role of clergy, everything started centering around that basic question. So that's my setup for looking at the four churches. At the end of the Middle Ages, at the beginning of the Reformation, at the end of the Reformation, there ended up being four basic movements, out of which our church came, from two of them. There's the Anabaptists, Lutheranism, the Reform movement of Switzerland and in Germany, and the Anglican movement. Our church comes from those two traditions. But we're going to look, next session, we're going to look at all four. Give a brief look at all four. Or, I think, or maybe we might look at one, depending on how this goes if I try to do all four in maybe 4-hour session. So I went through a lot of stuff really quickly. So now is question and answer. So, was this interesting? Okay, did you follow everything? I didn't get over anybody's head? Yeah. The reason why we have a mic up here is when you have a question, ask the question so that people on Facebook can hear your question.
Or check, there it is.
There we go, there we go. Now you're really going to have a voice, Annette.
Are you going to include a discussion of works?
Of works. Oh,
Works versus
well, yeah,
grace?
that'll
Is
work.
that
That'll
part of it?
come into the discussion as far as, especially when we look at Lutheranism, because Luther really took on the question of whether we are saved by grace or by our works. So, yeah, it's going to come up in the conversation. She beat you to it. Anybody else? Are you lost?
I was never under the impression,
Or turn it
I
on.
was never under the impression that Luther believed in predestination. I thought it was between Luther and the
The theory of, or the doctrine of predestination wasn't as fully developed within Luther as it was in the other reformers, specifically John Calvin and
That's what I
Ulrich
was
Zwingli. Calvinism especially, which out of Calvinism we have one of the churches that came out of Calvinism was the Presbyterian Church, which for the history of the Presbyterian Church, predestination was a very strong part of their doctrine. But it was all through the Reform movement in Switzerland. Ulrich Zwingli believed very strongly in predestination. But Luther did also, because if you follow that God, the power resides in God, then naturally would follow from that God even determines your actions. How Erasmus dealt with that is he focused on not so much the omnipotence of God or the all power of God, but the omniscience of God, or the fact that God is all-knowing. So that what Erasmus said is that, yes, God knows what we're going to do before we do it. The allegory, trying to think, the metaphor he used for it was, he says, an astronomer can know that a solar eclipse is going to happen, right? Can predict when the solar eclipse is going to happen, because the astronomer knows how things work, is all-knowing in that fact. But the astronomer isn't causing the solar eclipse, right? So God isn't causing this event, causing our decision. God just is all-knowing and knows what we're going to do. So what in our understanding, very often we attribute to God causing the event is just God knowing ahead of time that we did it. You can take that for what you will. But that's how he answered that question.
Can we move on?
Yes.
Does it need to be said, or that in the early days that the church and the state were one, that there was no other authority.
Yeah, especially during the Middle Ages. Well, even before that. From Constantine on, during the whole Holy Roman Empire and through the Middle Ages, the church was connected with the power structures. The emperor curried favor with the church because the church had a lot of property and had a lot of money, had a lot of power, and had a lot of influence. And the church curried favor with the emperor so that they could deal with heretics. And they could maintain their power. So it was, I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Now that doesn't mean that they always got along. There were some popes that didn't get along with the emperor, and there's some emperors that didn't get along with the popes. And there's always that kind of tension, because sometimes you can just imagine it happens with human egos. Who's more powerful, right? And these were all men, by the way. There's no women in there. So this was a very male-dominated system. In fact, it was a male-exclusive system.
Jumping ahead a couple hundred years into the 16s, 1700s. As I understand, I could be completely wrong, but the church that the United Church of Christ came through was very influential in early American politics. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. As a preview, the four churches that formed the United Church of Christ were the German Evangelical Synod, the Reformed Church of America, the Congregational churches, and the Christian churches. The Congregational churches were an American invention. They started in America because they were the Puritans. And so, especially in New England, they carried a lot of power and a lot of influence. So yeah, you could say that they were intimately connected with the power of our country. In fact, Old South Church, which Tracy has visited, and I did my field education in seminary, the story was that the Revolutionary War was essentially waged between the King of England and the deacons of Old South Church. Because in those deacons, in the deacon, in membership, and at one time deacons were Benjamin Franklin was baptized in the church, and now I can't think of
several presidents.
Samuel Adams was a deacon of the church, and so there's a lot of connections. Boston. So the church, throughout the history of the church, there has always been the connection with political power. We have never had a time in the history of the church where the church has been separated from political power. Never. From the very beginning. I said connected. They were connected somehow. They didn't necessarily enjoy the power, but they were always connected with the political systems in one way or another, either adversely or communally. They could never separate themselves completely from political power. Even in Jesus' time, the Roman power structures influenced the Jewish, the Sanhedrin had a close relationship with the Roman government.
It's my understanding that until Constantine, that the church was independent of the state, and it became entwined with the state from that time on.
It was independent in that it was being persecuted, but through the persecution, it couldn't escape the connection with the political power. I know it's a nuance. You're calling me on the nuance, Dayton. Anything else? Okay. See you next time.